All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into one of the most complicated figures in the entire Greek pantheon, the god Apollo. We're talking about one of the big 12 Olympians, a son of Zeus, and a guy who seems to have his hands in, well, pretty much everything.
But that's where things get interesting. I mean, how can one god be the divine voice of prophecy, the master of music, and also the one who shoots plague-infested arrows into cities? It just doesn't seem to add up, right? It's a major contradiction. So to figure this out, we're going to take a look at what I like to call his divine resume.
Okay, so let's just run through this, and wow, take a look at this list. He's the god of prophecy, music, poetry, healing, and then boom, plague. He's a master of archery, a bringer of law and light. Even his symbols tell the story, right? You've got the lyre for art and then the bow and arrows for total destruction. It's an absolutely wild and contradictory job description. You've got a healer who kills, a lawmaker who can be chaotic, a bringer of light with a seriously dark side.
So, to really get a handle on the god behind this, well, this impossible resume, we have to break it down. And we're going to start right at the beginning, his family and his, let's say, dramatic entry into the world. So here are the basics. His parents, Zeus, king of the gods, and the titaness, Leto. He's also got a very famous twin sister, Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. And his birthplace is super important. He was born on this tiny, once floating island called Delos. Why? Because a seriously jealous Hera, that's Zeus's wife, forbade any land under the sun from giving Leto shelter. Delos was literally the only place that would take her in. Okay, so with that backstory in mind, let's tackle the first major item on his resume. And this is probably his most famous role of all, being the god of prophecy. This was the source of his incredible power and influence across the entire ancient world. And the absolute epicenter of that power was Delphi. You have to imagine this. Kings, generals, even regular people would make this incredibly difficult journey to this spot on Mount Parnassus, all of them hoping to get a glimpse into the future, to know the will of the gods. But here's the thing. Apollo didn't just, shout prophecies down from the sky. He actually spoke through a human vessel, a priestess known as the Pythia. She was his oracle, his literal mouthpiece on earth. In the whole process, it was totally shrouded in mystery. So a pilgrim would come with their question. Then the Pythia would enter this trance-like state, supposedly by inhaling these sacred vapors. They called it pneuma, that came from a crack in the rock. Apollo would then basically possess her, and she would speak his divine will. But it wasn't a nice, clear answer. Priests then had to step in and try to interpret her often cryptic, rambling words.
And that gets right to the heart of his prophecies. They were famously, well, slippery. In fact, one of his titles was Loxias, which basically translates to ambiguous. A king might ask if he should go to war and get a reply like, "A great empire will fall." Great, but which one? His or the enemy's? That ambiguity, that mystery, was a huge part of the oracle's power.
Okay, so now let's get to the first major contradiction on that resume. Because at the exact same time he's guiding humanity with his wisdom, Apollo was also the god in charge of public health. And that could be a good thing or a very, very bad thing.
Yeah, it's a real tale of two Apollos. On one hand, he was worshipped as Asclepius, which means the healer. In fact, his own son Asclepius became the literal god of medicine. But, on the other hand, this same god could unleash the most horrific plagues. His arrows didn't just bring death, they could carry disease. He famously did this to the Greek army in the Iliad. So, he gives life with one hand and he takes it away with the other.
And this destructive power was there right from the start. To claim Delphi as his own temple, a young Apollo had to kill this monstrous serpent, the python, that was guarding the place. And according to the myth, he did it with a single arrow. His skill with the bow was this perfect symbol of both protection for his followers and just complete devastation for his enemies.
All right, next up on the resume. Moving beyond prophecy and plague, Apollo had a much more refined side. He was the divine patron of music, of poetry, of all the arts.
He was known as Musagetes, which means the leader of the muses, the 9 goddesses of inspiration. Picture him with his lyre, leading this divine choir. He was the source of all harmony and beauty. He wasn't just a fan of art, he practically was art.
But, and you knew there was a but coming, this artistic grace had a terrifying edge. And this brings us to a really important rule in Greek mythology. You never, ever, ever challenge the god of music to a contest. It's a lesson a Saturn named Marsyas would learn in the worst way imaginable.
So Marsyas, who was this brilliant flute player, got so full of himself that he challenged Apollo. And they agreed to a pretty chilling rule for their little showdown. The winner could do whatever he wanted to the loser.
Well, Apollo of course won. And as punishment for Marsyas's arrogance, he had the satyr flayed alive. Just think about that. The god of sublime beauty and harmony reveals a capacity for just unimaginable brutality. And there it is again, that stark, terrifying duality.
So, what do we do with all of this? Prophecy, healing, plague, music, and shocking violence. I mean, how does this completely confusing resume make any sense at all? Let's try to tie it all together.
And I think a quote from our source material really holds the key here. It says that Apollo is considered the most Hellenic, or the most purely Greek of all the gods.
And maybe that's the answer. He wasn't a mess of contradictions at all. He was a perfect representation of the Greek worldview. For them, the world was a balance of opposites. You can't have prophecy without ambiguity. Healing is fundamentally tied to the concept of plague. The beauty of music exists in the same world as violence. It's civilization versus savagery, law versus chaos, light versus darkness.
Apollo wasn't just the god of these things, he was the god of the tension between them. He embodied that constant, difficult human struggle to create order and law and beauty out of the raw, chaotic, and often violent stuff the world is made of.
Which leaves us with one last thought. He embodies our highest ideals, logic, art, civilization, but also our most brutal, savage impulses. Order and chaos, creation and destruction, all wrapped up in one radiant, terrifying god. So the real question is, does this make Apollo the perfect god or the most terrifying?